Okay, so our first guest is, in our keynote, is Joris Krijger from the Volksbank, so a Dutch bank. Joris is AI and ethics officer at the bank. He's also the professor of ethics and artificial intelligence at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. He's working on ethical aspects of how we use AI and how AI should be regulated. He's also the founding editorial board member of Springer Nature's AI and Ethics journal. Hello, Joris.
Hey, good morning, Lucas.
Okay, that's your presentation. And before we start, just one short reminder. If you find that some of the topics Joris mentions are important, or you have questions, please do type them in the chat. We'll have a bit of time for a short Q&A, so we can discuss these at the end of presentation by Joris. Joris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lucas. Hello, everyone. Welcome at this session on the purpose and value of explainable AI. I think I should say dzień dobry. Good morning, and I'll be talking to you about the purpose and the value of explainable AI. And just a small correction to the very generous introduction Lucas gave me. I am not a legal scholar, but an ethics scholar, and I don't know which one is worse, but my perspective will be mainly oriented and focused on the ethical aspects of explainable AI and why I think we need to have explainable AI in practice. So very briefly, what do? I am an ethics and AI officer at the Volksbank. I do a PhD on AI and ethics at the Erasmus University, and I'm the founder of a community, the Ethical Data Science Association within the Netherlands. All of them I've been doing for over 5 years now, and they are driven by the same interest, which is how can we shape and develop and deploy AI systems that are responsible and in alignment with our human values. So here you see the ethics is coming around the corner. So how can we use AI in a responsible manner? And explainable AI is, of course, a very important keystone in using AI responsibly. And so I thought to start today with just trying to outline or trying to flesh out what the concept of explainable AI is. Probably all of you already have an intuition of what explainable AI means, but I think it could be useful to look at what the exact definition is. And so normally when we talk about explainable AI, we think of it as in the following way. We see it as an ability to explain a machine learning outcome. So there's an input, it goes into a machine learning model that is often a black box. Then we have the output, and explainable AI is sort of the ability to look into what's happening into the black box. This is, I think, the most simple definition we have of the black box challenge. So you have the input, goes into some black box, and then you have an output. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than this, even though this is a very good start. There's more to say about what explainable AI is than just what happens in the black box between the input and the output of a machine learning system. Because one question you could ask is explainable AI like a single ability? Is it the ability to explain a machine learning outcome? Because there are different techniques you can use and there are different capabilities that can produce an explanation. So perhaps it's not as easy as that. It's not just the ability to explain a machine learning outcome. Perhaps we should update our definition a little bit and say, okay, maybe it's not the ability, but it's a set of capabilities that produces an explanation of a machine learning outcome. Well, then you can raise another question. Is there one form of explanation? So we said explainable AI is a set of capabilities that produces an explanation of a machine learning outcome. But what form of explanation is that? You have global explanations, would give you what is driving the algorithm. You can do regression modeling that provides you a set of explainable factors. You have, of course, inherently interpretable models that don't require any bolted-on explanation tools. And you have the more local or individual explanations. So you could say, well, there's not just one form of explanation. Perhaps it's a little bit more nuanced than that again. So we need to update our definition and perhaps say, well, explainable AI is a set of capabilities that produces an explanation in the form of details, reasons, or underlying reasoning. With all these new techniques and capabilities, you can generate different forms of explanation that tell you different things about the black box that we're trying to come to understand. But then the question arises, why? Why would we actually want an explanation? And what is the purpose of having an explanation of this black box? And I think you could very well argue that the purpose of getting an explanation is to at least make the functioning or the results sufficiently clear so that we know where it's coming from, what the underlying reasoning is, so that we're able to understand it. So we update the definition again, and we say, okay, explainable AI now is a set of capabilities that produces an explanation, different forms of explanation, details, reasons, underlying reasoning, to make the functioning and or results of an AI sufficiently clear so that it is understandable. Very well. Then the next question is, to whom should it be understandable? And then I think you could say, well, there are various people who have some stakes in getting an explanation. And it could be citizens, it could be consumers, it could be regulators, policymakers, it could be oversight bodies. It could, of course, be your own data scientist trying to understand what's going on in the model. So there are various stakeholders, you could say, that warrant an explanation, and that also have different stakeholder concerns. If you're a data scientist, you're primarily occupied with seeking to improve the model, to perhaps debug the model, and explanations are very helpful in that. But if you're a consumer, you don't actually care about debugging the model. You just want to know why a certain result came through for you and what you can do to perhaps change the outcome of the model to improve your outcome. From an oversight body perspective, you could say we just want to make sure it's justified. The use of the model and the way it's functioning is justified, and we need to assess whether that is the case or not. So all these stakeholders have different stakeholder concerns. And so when we're trying to make the functioning of an AI sufficiently clear and understandable, we need to take into account that these explanations are for different stakeholders and should address different stakeholder concerns. So that gives us a way more complex definition of explainable AI. We went from just the ability to explain a machine learning outcome to a stakeholder-driven definition, where we shifted from, you could say, a technological interpretation of explainable AI to a more social, psychological understanding of what explainable AI is. So the definition now is, given a stakeholder, explainable AI is a set of capabilities that produces an explanation in the form of details, reasons, or underlying reasoning to make the functioning and or results of an AI sufficiently clear so that it's understandable to that stakeholder and addresses the stakeholder's concerns. So you see, that's a lot more complex than what we started out with. It's not just the ability to throw out an explanation or to have some sort of technical understanding of what's happening in the black box. It's tailored toward stakeholders' concerns. It needs to be understandable to stakeholders. And the explanation itself is not a uniform explanation, but has various manifestations that it can entail. This is not a definition I came up with, by the way. It's from a study in 2020, a meta-study on explainable AI. As I said, I'm a researcher, so I'm very much interested in scientific developments in this field. And I think this is a very apt definition of explainable AI because it not just captures the technical aspects of it, but it tries to capture the ecosystem in which an AI functions and the role explainability plays in that ecosystem. So it's not just enough to have some form of understanding or functioning of an AI, but you need to be sure that your stakeholders understand it and that your stakeholders' concerns are addressed by the explanation you are given. So this will be the definition I will be building on when I'm presenting my my thoughts on explainable AI. And I thought the best way to structure this session would be with these 3 steps, because we've now outlined what the black box challenge is, what explainable AI entails, but why is it such an important challenge to tackle? Why do we need to address this right now? Why isn't it sufficiently addressed, or at least sufficiently, in my opinion, addressed in the current discourse we are having on explainable AI? And this is what Lucas also hinted to, what does it actually mean to bring this definition into practice and to, as a bank in my case, start working with explainable AI? So what is required to bring explainable AI into practice? I see some questions in the chat, and let me just very briefly point out that I'll address them at the end of this session. And in case there's anything urgent, I think you can raise your hand and we'll address it immediately. But if you just put them in the chat, Lucas will pick them up and we'll come back to them in the discussion section of this talk. So three main themes to outline in the very brief time that we have together. The stakes of the black box challenge, the shortcomings of the current discourse, and what is actually required to bring explainable AI into practice. Now, to start with the stakes, this might seem obvious. We all want systems that are explainable, but I think we should see it in a bit of a broader and larger context. AI is rapidly changing the world. This is an IMF report that was released in January this year, where they expect that AI will have an impact on around 40% of the jobs worldwide, and in the more advanced economies, this will be up to 60%. And they distinguish the impact as complementary or non-complementary. And you could say that roughly half of the exposed jobs will benefit from AI integration. So here there is high exposure to AI impact, but it's also complementary. So it will help people do their jobs. It will enhance productivity. But for the other half, and this is of course concerning, AI applications may execute tasks currently performed by a human. Now, this might not seem like a lot, but 60% of jobs being affected by AI means that it will have a tremendous impact on the way our societies are structured, the way organizations operate, the nature of work itself. Even if it's just complementary, we want to know that we are in control of these systems and that these systems are used responsibly, given their tremendous impact on our world. And we know for a fact that AI could affect the income and wealth inequality that already exists. And here you have all the subsequent issues of polarization, economic inequality, political inequality, that of course has a lot of dangers for social democracies that we currently live in. So AI is not just a new tool or a new gadget that will help us improve our jobs. It will fundamentally change the way we go about living our lives and doing our jobs. And I think this is important to understand to get a sense or an impression of the stakes when it comes to explainable AI. Now, we also know that AI is not always acting in a most ethical manner. And I didn't include the recent Google Gemini image generation scandal here, but there are many incidents out there of AI systems behaving unethically. And if you think back of the percentage of AI jobs that will be or jobs that will be impacted by AI, you can already see a quite broad societal challenge emerging. Because if there are 60% of jobs that are impacted by AI, and these AI systems tend to make at least ethically questionable decisions, then we can see that there's really something going on that we need to address. So the dilemma is this: the more we involve AI in our daily lives, the more we need to be able to trust the decisions these systems make. And machine learning models by nature, they are opaque, they are non-intuitive, and they are complex. And you can see that there's a tension there, an ethical tension, you could say, between the trust we can have in these systems and we can place in these systems, also given the unethical outcomes we've seen in the past, and the very nature of machine learning models. and the way they are operating. So that is, I think, an important aspect to the concept of explainable AI. It's not just a technical issue of making sure we know what's going on in the model. There's a large societal stake in having explainable AI organized in a responsible manner too. And I think if you relate that to, for example, the issue of justice or the issue of fairness, you can see that explainable AI is often considered a prerequisite to have fair machine learning systems. Because by their very nature, and this is from a report from Purcell, machine learning algorithms can learn to discriminate based on, you could say, morally irrelevant characteristics such as gender, age, sexual orientation, or any other perceived differences between groups and people. And to make sure that these discriminatory factors or proxies or surrogate data for these factors don't unintentionally cross an ethical line, requires explainable AI. It requires that you know what is going on inside your model. So for me, explainable AI, it's not just about the reliability that you see in the top left corner. It's about the transparency, it's about privacy issues, it's about fairness, trust that we can have in these AI systems. And trust, of course, is key to scaling and adopting AI system at scale. It is also related to its usability. But normally we just look at the usability and the reliability of an AI system when we think of explainable AI. But I think there's this very broad spectrum of societal issues that are related to it, and some key ethical values, I would say, that are very much related to explainable AI and having explainable AI in place. So for me, explainable AI relates to what has been called in the literature an ecosystem of trust. And an ecosystem of trust is not just a nice to have. It is not just something that it would be nice if we have an ecosystem of trust, but it's absolutely critical if we want to use AI on a broad scale, and if we want to have innovative new ideas, if we want regulators to allow us to use artificial intelligence. And so trust, I have a background in philosophy and psychology. Trust is, of course, a very interesting concept. Because it is a subjective attitude. It is not something, for example, as a bank, that we can say we are trustworthy, but we are not the ones determining whether we are trustworthy or not. That's up to customers. That's up to regulators. They should say whether we are trustworthy. So it's like a very very interesting psychological concept. And so. Relating explainable AI to an ecosystem of trust for me is about the responsibilities and the distribution of responsibilities. So an ecosystem of trust has been defined as a system of interacting organisms and their environment in which appropriate norms are clear to parties and responsibilities are well defined and adequately fairly allocated to actors and agents. Trust needs to be horizontal and between citizens and parties, and vertical between citizens and governments. So trust is like really important. And for me personally, and this is my research interest, this relates very much to the topic of responsibility. Because one of the issues we can see arising with autonomous systems like AI is that what is called a responsibility gap might emerge. Where it becomes really difficult to actually attribute responsibility to human agents who are involved in development and deployment of AI systems. Now, why is that? Well, a prerequisite for responsibility is control. We cannot hold you accountable for actions you have no control over. That makes no sense. The problem with artificial intelligence, of course, is that as it interacts with its environment, it learns, and it sort of shapes its own behavior. Which makes it very difficult even for the person programming an AI system to have control over the behavior of an AI system, which makes it in a legal and in a moral sense very difficult to assign responsibility. And having explainable AI in place would mean that we can still maintain meaningful human control and could maintain this key value of responsibility and the allocation of responsibility. So I think, just to sum up, explainable AI is not just relevant in a technical sense, but it plays a pivotal role in making sure AI is aligned with our human values and in a controllable and assertable way aligned with human values. Now, of course, this has been picked up by many frameworks, and many organizations working on frameworks. What you see here is a meta study of frameworks that were published up to 2020. There were, I think, around 60 frameworks already, and they looked at the values to which these frameworks converged. And of course, explainability has a role in that. It is also part of the regulation. You will hear more about that later. But in the risk-based regulation, where the EU basically says we have unacceptable risks that are not allowed on the EU market, high-risk applications where we have some more stringent regulation, and we have limited risk and minimal risk, where we also have some transparency norms in place, explainability plays a key role. So for the high-risk systems, you can see explainability aspects on the human oversight, the risk management, the transparency and provision of information. All of these, I would say, relate to explainability. But what is interesting, or at least what I think is very interesting as somebody working in academia and in practice, is that this is not very broadly picked up on in practice. This is from an IBM study published in 2023, and they just reviewed, I think, 8,000 managers in IT sectors to make sure to assess to what extent, for example, explainability is taken into account. And they found that 61% is not making sure they can explain AI-powered decisions. So that's quite a large number, you could say. Almost 2/3 of the parties using AI are not taking explainability into account, even though it plays such a critical role in the responsible use of AI. So I think that's interesting, and it got me thinking, what's going on there? And I think what's going on is that perhaps there are some shortcomings to our understanding of explainable AI as we have it now. Because explainable AI isn't solved with technical tools. This, of course, goes back to the definition that we fleshed out earlier, where we said, well, explainable AI is not just providing an explanation or the ability to explain an AI. It needs to be tailored to explainees. And this is something that, for example, Lime or Shep cannot help you with. You can ask, is it a good reflection? Are they good explanations? And what makes a good explanation is their fit with explainees. So who are your stakeholders? Who needs these explanations? Consumers, citizens, clients, regulators, they all have different concerns and information needs. So an auditor might need a justification for a certain model. Developers will use explainable AI for verification purposes, regulators for compliance purposes. More from a legal perspective, you want to make sure that AI behaves in a fair and equitable way. Citizens just want to understand their specific decision. And management needs to understand how an AI works for strategy decisions and development. So all these stakeholders have different concerns and information needs. And conceptualizing explainable AI merely as a technical tool might miss the mark on finding the fit with these explainees and with these stakeholders. That relates to my second aspect. I think equally important in finding who your stakeholders are is thinking about how you communicate with them. So the delivery of an explanation is not the same for every stakeholder. Technical tools, they don't deliver explanations in the language that stakeholders need it. A data scientist might use the explanations generated by Lime or Shep, but it's not something you can just send over to a customer and say, well, here is the explanation of our AI model. You need to speak and to translate that explanation into their language in a way they understand what's going on. So that holds for all the different perspectives you can have on having an explanation. So from a development perspective, you want it in a language that helps you to debug and improve the model. Managers need it in a language that helps them conceptualize the strategy part of it, for example. End users want to know whether they can trust it or not. So that's a very nuanced and also psychological process. where it isn't necessarily the case that more explanation is a better explanation, because studies have shown that if you provide too much of an explanation, for example, to end users, people become suspicious. So they think, why am I getting all this explanatory remarks? There must be something wrong with the system that they're providing me all this information about how it is working. So you need to strike a very fine balance between what you provide and the way in which you provide it. This, of course, relates to the third shortcoming, and that is thinking about the usefulness. What does an explanation need to include to be useful to an explanee? So first you need to think of who is my stakeholder, in what language should I address the stakeholder. But I think a very important third point is, what do they actually need out of the explanation for them to be useful? So of course it needs to explain the model, but there's also an aspect of accuracy there. It needs to be relevant for their situation. There need to be some boundaries in place so that a system is not providing explanations give explanations that it shouldn't give. And of course it needs to be a feedback to understand and to improve the explanations that you generate. So all in all, I would say these are three important aspects of why explainable AI isn't just solved with technical tools and cannot just be understood as a technical issue. There's very much an ethical and communicative aspect to explainable AI that we need to take into account. Who are the stakeholders? How can we communicate in the most effective way with them? And what makes an explanation useful for them? So that brings me to my final and third part of this presentation, which is, okay, given all the previous remarks, how do we incorporate that into practice? Now, just very briefly, what we did at Volksbank was we started already 5 years ago with determining our principles and policies for ethical AI. Explainable AI was part of that. And we determined the impact on our model landscape. And we tried around with a couple of different methods to actually operationalize ethics for AI. We ended up with a governance framework about how to implement the policy and the governance that we have. That has at its core an ethics office that is a specific part of the organization that performs ethical reviews as part of the development process. So mainly it looks like this. Our mission is to be in control of the ethical aspects of data science applications developed, deployed, and used within the Volksbank. And we set up a new governance structure where we have an ethics office that documents and reviews all the ethical aspects and decision-making aspects of AI applications. It provides them to an ethical advisory board, which provides an hands-on evaluation as a sort of organizational approval of the ethical review the ethics office draws up. And we have, in case of when there are large strategic or societal positioning issues at stake, an ethics committee that can help with these normative judgments. For example, how should we provide an explanation, or is it necessary to provide an explanation? And so we make sure that our ethics office is aligned with the model governance banks already need to have in place, with the privacy regulations, but it addresses some aspects that are not necessarily in privacy regulations or in current model risk modeling, which mainly focuses on the technical issues or the use of data. And we are looking at issues such as responsibility, fairness, transparency, and of course, explainability. So with that background, the way we went about operationalizing explainable AI at the Volksbank is that we said, okay, so it needs to be tailor-made to specific stakeholder concerns. And so we defined 6 major stakeholders for our applications, and we distinguished 3 approaches to communicating with them. So we, of course, have our customers that need to have an explanation, and we, of course, have society as a stakeholder that could be interested in why we are using models and the way we are using models. And we decided that we should have sort of a proactive approach in this. So we should have a document in place in case somebody asks about the way a model functions. We need to understand ourselves what is required for these stakeholders. So the strategy we have for society and customers is explain to justify why we're using AI systems, justify how an AI system is working and whether and why we think it's trustworthy. Then we have business and developers. So this is more internal. And here we have explain to improve, you could say. And explain to improve already, we believe, should be part of the current practice. So a lot of the important building blocks of an explanation we already need to have in place because of the standard documentation and the documentation standards that we already have. So we don't need to generate any new info there. We just need to structure and organize the information that we have in a way that it allows us to do additional testing to make sure we can debug and improve the model. But this very much should be part of current practice. It shouldn't be a surprise that we need explanations for these stakeholders. And then, of course, we have explain to control, you could say. So that's our internal control, the compliance departments, the audit departments, also the external oversight bodies and regulators, where we can provide explanations per request. And explain to control also means that they have different information requirements as well. So society and customers, they will not be very much interested on the training data, the test runs, the updates, the model documentation and updates. But all these aspects are relevant for internal control and oversight. So that's something to keep in mind when you set up your explainable AI framework. So we have 6 stakeholders with 3 approaches. You could say explain to justify for society and customers, explain to improve for business and developer, and explain to control for internal control and oversight. Just very briefly to give you an impression of what that looks like, we used a framework developed by the University of Applied Science in Utrecht, and they looked at the various aspects that could comprise an explanation. So the reasons, details, or underlying causes for a specific outcome, the data used to train the AI solution, all these aspects. And they looked at the ethical, social, legal, and functional aspects and which ones are required in what case. And they tailored that, and we collaborated with them to come up with these tables, these figures, to the type of explanation. So the reasons, whether that's for an external stakeholder, a service provider, other stakeholders, and the X's just indicate the type of content that might be especially relevant for that stakeholder. So here you have on one axis the types of explanations, the things you could share information about, and on the other axis the type of stakeholder and the information that might be relevant for them. So this is just to give you an impression, and this white paper, it's online, it's available, open access, so you can look that up if you're interested, and I can share a link later if that's interesting for you. You can look that up if you're interested in this stakeholder-driven approach to explainable AI. So that brings me to the end of what I wanted to share with you, and just a very brief recap of what I've been outlining in this session. So first we started with the definition of explainable AI, which is way more nuanced than just the ability to explain a machine learning system. It is actually tailored to stakeholders' concerns. It needs to be understandable for them, and it needs to be addressing their concerns, and that could happen in various forms of explanations. Then I outlined why I think this is such an important challenge for the ecosystem of trust and the meaningful allocation of responsibility in that ecosystem of trust, which makes explainable AI actually pivotal in fostering this ecosystem of trust. I addressed some of the shortcomings we currently have when understanding explainable AI merely as a technical issue, which is it doesn't capture the explanees and the stakeholders, the communication or the language they might need to be informed, and it doesn't address why or what makes an explanation useful for them. And third, I think when you look at the operationalization, I give you a brief impression of what we did as Volksbank to make sure we address the different stakeholder concerns in our model documentation and development and deployment of AI. So let me close with this. I think we all have something to contribute to defining the future of trustworthy AI. And the question I always like to ask at the end of talks that address ethical topics is, what role will you play? Because everyone, I think, has something to contribute to this field. We're all here because we're interested in explainable AI, and I hope each of you will play a very positive and contributive role in making our AI ecosystem more trustworthy and responsible. Thank you. I think there is still some time for questions. Let me just briefly say, if you find this interesting and want to continue this conversation, find me on LinkedIn, and I've been more than happy to talk on specific issues with you.
Joris, thank you very much for this very important talk. And from what we see, it raised many questions in our audience.
Good.
So asking one by one, first one was, is it generative AI unexplainable by nature? And the second one is a kind of related, because what if we cannot trust generative AI because it will be not truthful in given explanation of its decision? So how do you tackle this?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Generative AI is of course, you could say, a different challenge to just the machine learning models that we're using for predictions and recommendations, because the output is no longer quantitative, but it could be practically anything. It could be an image, a video, a text. And they are, of course, deep learning models with so many data points, billions, that is very difficult to point to where the outcome comes from. Plus, it can vary over time. It will provide you different outcome in various instances. So that, I agree, seems to be inherently unexplainable. But what we did, for example, we have a use case in finance where we have an LLM, but then used for internal documentation. So you can just ask questions rather than looking for the right documents. You can just ask, as a cybersecurity officer, what certificates do I need to have? And it provides you an answer based on the internal policies that you have. But it also gives you the documents on which it has based the answer. So perhaps the ChatGPTs of this world, they're very difficult to explain, but I think you can use generative AI in a manner that is explainable, or where you incorporate explainability in the design of the generative AI system. And one thing I would like to add, but this is more an ethical connotation, is that I think we should always balance, and this is inherently to ethics, different values. So perhaps we can make a very good case for a model that performs better, and this is the common trade-off, high performance versus low explainability. And you should always balance those values. As a bank, you need to detect money laundering, financing of terrorism. And you could say, if you have a model there that performs better but is unexplainable, you could have a really meaningful ethical debate about whether we still want a lesser performing model that is explainable, or whether we say, well, in this case, given that it's about the financing of terrorism, we think it's acceptable that it's no longer explainable, or not that explainable. Perhaps we need to bolt on some explanation afterwards. But these are very nuanced debates about whether it's desirable to have explainable or high-performing models.
Okay. Another question is, would generative AI be classified as an entity per se for the legal purposes, like individual or legal person, and could that remedy ethical considerations?
I think, and I'm not sure if this question is referring to that, but we had the case of, I think it's Air Canada, of an airline in Canada, at least 1 week or 2 weeks ago, where a chatbot said that a person buying a ticket, a last-minute ticket, could get a discount because it was for a funeral. And when this person tried to claim the discount, it turned out no such policy exists. And this person filed legal charges. And the defense of the airline was that the chatbot was a separate legal entity, And of course, the judge overruled it because they said, well, you are responsible for the content on your website. And this person got their ticket fully compensated by the airline because the judge ruled so. And I think in some instances, it might help. Of course, we have other legal entities and legal persons, such as corporates, for example, that have some sort of legal personality. But for AI, I think it might worsen the responsibility gap rather than help us improve it. Because what does it mean to hold an AI to account, to find an AI? An AI doesn't have any assets you can seize, for example. So it will be a very complex debate, and I think it might lead to a huge deflection of responsibilities from large corporations, such as you've seen the Canadian airline try to deflect the responsibility for the false information their chatbot provided.
Okay. Another question is about relying on decision by AI. So we have concerns regarding relying on AI. However, we don't hold people accountable to the same extent as we do with AI. So maybe not relying on, for example, this case about radiology, not relying on it in radiology would create risks for the patient, since AI can be more reliable than radiologists. So, like, how would you see this?
Yeah, I think there are two questions there. I mean, in some instances, I agree because, and I've been discussing this with some legal scholars as well. Right now, you have a right to human intervention, for example. So you have the right to have a human look at your outcome. But I can imagine in some instances, we would also want in the future a right to AI supervision, so that we also have like an AI system looking at our medical diagnosis, for example. So I think that could work. What I not necessarily agree with is that because we cannot always trust humans, we should accept that AI somehow is not fully trustworthy either. And I think the scale and the impact AI systems have warrants extra vigilance, you could say, when it comes to their ethical impact. And we don't let a single person. We don't, as an individual, we're capable of learning. We're capable of improving. But with AI systems, we are automating the status quo, and they learn from historical data. So they replicate the past, and we've seen many instances where that is to the disadvantage of currently marginalized groups, for example. So it doesn't help us in our pursuit for justice.
Mm-hmm. And maybe the last question, it's about high risk in AI Act. So from the point of view of the upcoming EU AI Act, credit risk models are considered as high risk. Therefore, there is higher concern for AI ethics. What are your thoughts on models used for fights against financial crime, stuff like anti-money laundering? Maybe we shouldn't be as picky regarding concerns because, like, it's against fighting crime.
I tend to disagree with you. I think the stakes of the model are still quite high. And I mean, there's a difference in saying they need to be regulated and risk management needs to be in place, and saying we shouldn't be using it, for example. And I think for all the models that have potential for considerable harm, it is very good to have risk management in place, data quality management in place, human oversight in place, and so on. And I would say the financial crime models that are currently being used, they warrant the same scrutiny as other high-risk models. So we need to be careful and we need to document what we're doing. But I think the really interesting part, and this is the ethicist speaking, is in balancing the values of an AI system. Because somehow, and I was saying this earlier, if we need to balance the performance of fighting financial crime versus its explainability or its fairness or its privacy, and this is an ongoing debate in the Netherlands right now, it becomes not a technical discussion, but a very normative discussion. What do we think is appropriate to find or detect financial crime? And when do we cross an ethical boundary? And do we need to say, even though perhaps it is technically possible and legally allowed, from a moral perspective, we don't want to venture into these waters because it's a very slippery slope. And that's, I think, the discussion we should be having way more. So I'm all for regulating these models as high-risk models, but I think they will not help us solve the moral issues of how to strike a balance between two equally important values, or, for example, the performance of the model and the fairness of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Just before we finish, you mentioned some papers and some links. I also see that in the chat we have one person asking about the reference paper. So if we could just like afterwards share the links in the chat. Okay, so I want to very much thank you for the both for the lecture and for answering questions from our audience. Thank you very much, Joris, for being with us today.
My pleasure, Lucas.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we are switching to another speaker.
Have a great conference.
Thank you.